Today I will be painting the Northern Lights. For this painting, I am using watercolor paper and gouache, but you could use acrylic or tempera paint as well. I'm beginning with a nice light yellow line towards the center of my picture, maybe a little bit lower. And then as you can see, I'm adding S's to my line, and my S's start off the top of my paper and then curve down to connect towards my yellow area on my paper. And as I make my S's, I can start them off pretty thin, but then I can add a little bit of extra thickness to them, especially along the curves. They can kind of float. If I want to, I can maybe even add some swirls or something in there. We'll see kind of what happens. I may save the swirls for later too, but for now, especially the S's, I want to have in there nice and bold with my yellow. And notice that they all go the same direction, so it doesn't really matter which direction as long as they're about the same. Next, I'm coming in with some blue, and I'm going right next to my S's. And I have kind of a lighter blue that I'm using first, so if you do have a variety of blues, it's kind of nice to have a lighter blue, or maybe even mix some white with your blue first, and then we can add some dark in later. So I'm going in between my S's, and I don't even have to let them dry. So if my paint is still a little bit wet and I go in with my blue, it's not that big of a deal because if they get a little bit of green, a lot of times the Northern Lights have a lot of green in them, so it does not matter if my paint blends a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and continue to fill all of the white in the sky with blue in between my S shapes. And I'm going to get that all nice and smooth. If you want to, you can even encourage some blending by overlapping your blue and your yellow a little bit. And then what I'll try to do next is kind of go in with a little bit more blue and kind of fill in some of those blue areas. This would be maybe if you had a darker blue, it would be a good time to kind of start bringing some of that in. I want to tone down my S's a little bit, or I can kind of change the shape a little bit too. Maybe I want it to be a little bit thinner in places or a little bit thicker in places. You can use that blue to make those adjustments. All right, I'm going to leave my sky for now, and I want to jump down to my ground. And here I'm just using blue and white, so you can see my brush is cleaned off. There's no yellow in it anymore. And I'm just mixing some blue and some white to make this kind of snowy ground on the bottom. Then I'm going to go back up and go into those darker blues like I said before. And I'm adjusting my S a little bit because I didn't like the shape of it. So you can totally change up the shape when you go in with a darker blue and change it and make it a little bit different. So I'm doing that with my darker blue now, kind of going in between my S's, and I can adjust any shapes if I want to kind of make them a little bit different. Now I'm using the same brush the entire time, but if it is too big and you'd rather switch to a smaller brush, you can totally do that. So it's all up to you. I'm filling in those areas with a little bit of darker blue. It kind of defines my shapes a little bit. You can even kind of bring it down and around in here to kind of fill up this area. Now, as I do this, I am trying to keep my lines nice and smooth, so I'm trying to avoid too much of a dry brush technique. If you are getting a lot of dry brush, you may want to make sure that you add a little bit of water to your brush or a little bit more paint so that kind of smooths it out. Now at this point, I'm kind of going back over my yellow and I want to just kind of smooth it out, tone it down a bit. It's a little bit bright, so by kind of overlapping it with some of the blue while the blue is still wet, it can kind of smooth out my yellow and darken it just a little bit because it's very, very bright still. So I'm just dipping my brush in yellow, bringing it back in, and then as I paint, I'm mixing with some of the blue because it's still wet. Now notice that the bottom line here is not perfect, doesn't go to the ground, and I'm going to be building up some other things there, so it won't matter too much. I also thought it might be fun to kind of throw some swirls in, so I'm trying to figure out a good spot to kind of have a little bit of a swirl action going on in my sky. So you can kind of play around with maybe throwing some swirls in. This is definitely not realistic, but I kind of like the swirly concept. So I wanted to have kind of some open areas where I threw some little swirls into the sky. So these are totally optional. Actually, I think I want to move this one up a little bit more. So I'm going to just kind of let that be, and I'll throw my swirl even higher. So because I'm using gouache or, tempera or acrylic, it's very forgiving. If I want to move things around, I can just move them and it's not that big of a deal. Just using the yellow right over the blue, so it's mixing and blending a little bit, and that's okay. All right, now I'm adding some distant mountains, and to do that I'm just using some blue, and my yellow is a little wet, and if it's okay if they mix and blend a little bit. I have a kind of a lighter blue first that I'm using just to kind of make these hills kind of off in the distance. And then as I get a little bit closer, I'm going to use a darker blue. So if you just have one blue, you can mix maybe a little bit of white with it to make it lighter, and then just go straight for blue to make it darker. But I want to kind of pull in some darks in here in front of the lights, and that makes it look like it has a little bit more depth. So I've got some that are farther away and some that are a little bit closer. I also like kind of covering my corners here to make those a little bit darker, and that way the eye will stay in the painting a little bit better. So we want our viewers to kind of keep their eyes in the painting, and by covering up the corners with a dark, that can kind of help them do that. And I'm leaving this kind of area of snow right in the middle. It's going to be a little bit lighter. So just kind of adding in some dark, making sure that it's nice and smooth. And then I am going to darken the center a little bit because it was so light. And then I'll darken my corners even more just to make them really kind of almost act as a frame for my picture. Add a little bit of light in the middle, a little dark in the corners. You can even have a little path that leads your eye into the painting if you would like. All right, I'm just going to make any other touch-ups with the sky. I feel like some of it's still a little bit bright on the yellow, so I'm kind of toning it down with some green or some light blue. Kind of works really well too. If you water it down a little bit, that can kind of make it so it's just a little bit of a wash instead of super bright. I can kind of make my little swirls stand out a little bit more. I could add another one kind of up in here if I want. So I've got a group of 3. I mean, it's really up to you and what you want to do as you are the artist. All right, at this point I want to add some stars. So I'm going to just take my brush with some white and I'm flicking paint onto my picture, and I like doing it by just flicking it off my finger because that gives me a lot of control. Then I want to add some trees, and I'm going to go with some pine trees. So I like to start with a straight line and then kind of work my way diagonally down on either side of my line. So you can see I'm going up at the top and then just kind of shaking my brush back and forth diagonally to make them look like some nice tall trees. I'm doing that on both sides. I think I'll just stick with a couple. Usually I like to work in odd numbers, so if I do just 3, for example, that's a nice odd number. Now you could also put a person or something in the middle if you'd like, but I think for now I'm just going to leave it with these nice little trees. All right, I'm going to take my tape off, which is kind of a fun reveal. It gives me a nice crisp white border, and I will call that a masterpiece. Thanks so much for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Please give it a like and subscribe, and I hope to see you again for more art fun. Have a good one.